everyone. Welcome to our talk on Embedded Device Hacking 101, an introductory talk, and a story of two root shells with Nokia's 5G router. Just wanted to start off and say thank you so much to CSEC for organizing this conference, as well as for all your hard work. So this talk will be a four-part saga. This includes software vulnerabilities, hardware hacking, firmware hacking, and any relevant vulnerabilities, as well as applying what we've learned to our victim, the 5G Optus router that came with Eddie's 5G Optus plan. So, starting off, let's meet the players. First, I'm Tiara. I'll be talking about software vulnerabilities with Victoria, who will then carry on to talk about hardware hacking and firmware hacking, and Eddie to talk about his 5G Optus router. So let's start off with, what are embedded devices? Well, they're single-use devices that me and you have at home. This includes things such as your microwave oven or even just, your Nintendo Switch. And also our Nokia 5G router, which we'll be talking about later on. So embedded devices run dedicated software on a computer hardware system that is enclosed within the device. So you're probably wondering, why are we talking about OWASP IoT top 10 vulnerabilities? Well, you realize that there are a lot of things that cross over between the IoT top 10 vulnerabilities, as well as embedded device vulnerabilities. So it's a great way to understand what is actually exploitable in an embedded device, including our wireless router, which is the Nokia 5G router. For your ease of understanding, we've split up these vulnerabilities into software and hardware vulnerabilities. Let's get started. So, software versus hardware hacking. Software hacking is the use of program knowledge to take advantage of the many applications and OS programs available on your embedded device. On the other hand, hardware hacking involves modifying physical components of a device in a way that it wasn't intended to. We'll go over the following hacking methods in a few slides. So, diving into software hacking. The first software vulnerability includes weak, guessable, or hard-coded passwords. So what do I mean by weak and guessable? This means that attackers can easily brute force these passwords, as there may be a lack of password policy implemented. What do I mean by hard-coded passwords? Well, for example, have you ever went into a browser and went into inspect element and then looked at the code and said, oh, I see hard-coded passwords there. What I mean is there could be an if statement that says, if the user equals admin and the password equals admin, they can log in. That's what I mean by hard-coded passwords. Next is insecure network services. This includes things such as open ports that are open on the embedded device. Why am I talking about port 7547? You might not know what this port is used for. This is actually a port used by internet service providers to actually remotely access your router. You may not even know it's open, but attackers can use this to actually gain unauthorized access to your device remotely and then turn your embedded device into a botnet. I'll also be talking about insecure transmission protocols such as Telnet, and all of these insecure network services can actually be exploited to actually leak data. It can lead to data theft, unauthorized control, as well as man-in-the-middle attacks and many more. Next is insecure default settings. This includes, again, hard-code passwords as well as known default credentials of the embedded device. So usually a lot of users don't really bother to change or, strengthen their password once they get the device. They just have default passwords, and there might even be super admin default credentials that you didn't even know about, which are publicly on the internet. You can just Google for the embedded device model and find the hard-coded, or you can find for the default credentials and then just try to exploit and log into the device that way. You'll notice that there's also a lot of excessive root permissions with these embedded devices, and there's no way for users to actually remediate any of the vulnerabilities that they find on the embedded device or actually provision any proper access control. Next is insecure ecosystem interfaces. What I mean is usually this is what me or you use to actually remotely interact with the device. This includes things such as backend APIs, mobile, web, and cloud interfaces. So a few of the vulnerabilities include a lack of authentication and authorization. So the embedded device or the web UI doesn't actually check you are who you say you are and that you're permitted to actually do and perform certain actions. Another one is input and output validation / sanitization. So if you see a login page and you see a user input form, you can perform a bunch of web application attacks if they're insecure. This includes things such as SQL injection, which allows the attacker to actually gain unauthorized access to your device. Another thing that ties in with another thing is also lack of secure update mechanisms. I don't know if you guys know, but there's actually a lot of malicious code and that can be injected in the fake firmware and software patches that are available on the internet. So it's important to check where the patches are actually coming from, as it could be coming from an attacker through a phishing link. And it's also important to consider whether your update is being delivered to your device encrypted or unencrypted. Can it be intercepted by an attacker? As by injecting that malicious code into your device, an attacker can corrupt and compromise your device. Lastly, this one ties in also with hardware hacking as well. The use of insecure or outdated components. This includes third-party software components and libraries and insecure OS platforms where an attacker can actually find out information about any compromised third-party software component libraries that are used for certain embedded devices and then attack that way. Next is insufficient privacy protection. So where is your data actually being stored? Is it encrypted? Is it secure? Is it being stored without your consent? Such lack of sufficient privacy protection can lead to things such as data leakage, data breaches, by exploiting the storage source or intercepting any network traffic. Next, this also ties in with insufficient privacy protection, but it's also important to consider where your data is being intercepted during data encryption stages. So now that we've learned a few of the IoT software vulnerabilities that link with embedded devices, it's time to get into software hacking for embedded devices. I'll be talking about malware, brute forcing your way in, as well as Victoria will be talking about the exploitation of software vulnerabilities and the exploitation of web UI services. So let's talk about malware. Malware is traditionally actually just used to only affect computers. However, development of IoT embedded devices means that you can find malware infiltrating your home devices. And such attacks can wreak havoc in your home. Can you imagine an attacker turning your embedded device into spyware through like your Ring doorbell or through baby cameras? It's important to note that although technology is progressing and your embedded device may seem top of the line and it's new, it doesn't mean that it's more secure than older models, and also certainly does not mean that your device is malware proof. It's important to consider that malware can actually infect your embedded device through a multitude of ways. First, as mentioned before, you can insert malware and malicious code into fake firmware and software patches that are found online or sent to users through a phish. An example of malicious code being sent through a phishing link is with TweetDeck, where fake hacked Twitter accounts were sending out multiple tweets to TweetDeck users being like, hey, you should update your TweetDeck with a link. And when they clicked on the link, they actually installed a Trojan on their device. For all of you guys that made on a TweetDeck is automatically updated and people didn't know that. So they unwillingly, unknowingly installed a Trojan on their device. Also, something that can be used to inject malware into your embedded device is attackers exploiting known vulnerabilities of your embedded device and actually setting up a backdoor. So a backdoor is where attackers can gain unauthorized access into closed systems, where your device can be turned into a botnet to attack other devices or services as well. Another way, as mentioned before, is through phishing emails and mobile apps. So you're probably wondering, how is that dangerous? Well, as mentioned before, by clicking on a phishing email, or maybe you have a malicious Android app that you're using on your phone, once your device actually connects to the network, a Trojan can then attempt to log into your embedded device by using default credentials. And if they are successfully logged in, they can perform something known as DNS redirection. DNS redirection is where credit card and credential skimming can occur as users' pages are then redirected to fake phishing pages that attackers have set up for you. This is actually done by actually changing the DNS server on the embedded device into the attacker's DNS server. So you're probably wondering what can happen once an attacker actually injects malware into your device. So there's a bunch of things that can happen. Your device can actually be hijacked, and essentially the attacker has full control of your device. They can access sensitive files that are passed on the network and perform man-in-the-middle attacks, as well as perform denial-of-service attacks and cause other devices on the network to actually install malware and hijack various network communications. Such thing I call the super spreader / worm. It's kind of like COVID. Your router can actually spread malware to other of the devices that are like connected on the network. Another question you're probably wondering is, how the hell do I purge out the malware from my embedded device? Well, and if I factory reset my device, will the malware be purged? The answer is yes, but not always. So depending on the malware that's infected your embedded device, usually the latest firmware and software patch and then factory resetting your device should be getting rid of the malware. However, new versions of malware that infect embedded devices can actually store copies of itself in the recovery partition of a hard disk, and it can actually infect and corrupt backups, which means that even if you do factory reset your device, the malware is still in your device. Another one is also for IoT, relating to IoT devices, but malware can actually store copies of itself in your peripherals, such as webcams, in the memory configurations. The configuration that actually is part of the memory, and then the malware can actually still be there even after the reboot. So the moral of the story is that you can only that you should apply only trusted software and firmware updates, and as soon as possible, making sure that it's from the manufacturer and not from a malicious attacker. I found this meme pretty interesting. This person could not use their dishwasher until after they updated their firmware, which I thought was pretty cool. Next, I'll be talking about password brute forcing. So password brute forcing can be split into online and offline attacks. So the first is online, where you can actually go for the web UI, where you chuck as many username and password combos until you get a bingo. So essentially, it's a trial and error type of attack. As well, offline, where you actually extract a hash from the firmware and then you take it offline and you crack it with tools. So you're probably wondering, what is the difference? Well, with online, there's something called rate limiting, where the amount of logins, the amount of failed logins, actually, there's a limit. There's a maximum of failed logins, and then once that's reached, you can't try to brute force or login anymore. Whereas with offline, it's not actually interacting with the application server. So you can try to perform as many attacks, brute forcing attacks offline, and there won't be any detection of your brute forcing as it's not shown in the logs, and it's also there's no rate limiting applied. So go ham, I guess. Next, I'll be talking about the many tools that you can use for password brute forcing. So you can use Burp Suite to actually intercept authentication and login requests, where you can find login fields such as username and password fields and set them as placeholders or fields, and use tools such as Padator to actually iteratively place credentials in the requests. You can also use Nmap, which is a Kali Linux tool, to find open ports for embedded devices. And it also has lots of pre-configured scripts to actually brute force services such as FTP, HTTP, and many more. You can also use Kali brute force tools such as Hydra, which can be used in conjunction with popular word lists found on the internet, and also Metasploit that can be used to perform credential attacks. There's plenty of payloads on there, and also it can scan for vulnerabilities on your embedded device as well. There's also one that's called Routersploit, which is less common. Routersploit actually comes with a variety of embedded device credentials that you can actually brute force with, and the list is sectioned with the embedded device model and the default credentials are under them. And for offline tools, we have John the Ripper and Hashcat for actually cracking the hashes offline. So now that the attack is brute force, what does this mean for you and what can they do? Well, attackers can do some pretty nasty stuff. Pretty much they have admin access, and they can do a bunch of things, including resetting the credentials of your router to establish persistent access and essentially lock you out, which sucks, right? And also they can manipulate router configurations and specify services and that only they want to allow or deny. They can also tweak with your firewall settings. They can also insert malware and malicious code. They can also perform DNS redirection mentioned earlier and fully take control of your embedded device. Now I'll hand it over to Victoria to talk about the remaining software hacking methodologies and hardware and firmware hacking methodologies.
Thanks, Tiara. So I'll be going through the other two methods of software hacking for today. So first one is the exploitation of software vulnerabilities. So first question, how is it actually done? Publicly disclosed and reported vulnerabilities or source code leaks can be exploited before patches can be applied. This method of exploitation is common since these vulnerabilities are linked to the router model that users may not know about or have not updated the software/firmware patch. Further, the device may not have a patch if it uses out-of-date third-party software libraries. Such vulnerabilities can include authentication bypasses via path traversal, allowing attackers to execute arbitrary code, which can lead to larger-scale attacks. So what are some tools that can exploit software vulnerabilities? So as Tiara mentioned earlier, Metasploit and Routersploit are two pen testing tools that are pre-installed in Kali, actually. And they can do many things such as scanning and reconnaissance. And in this case, it can exploit known vulnerabilities and test it against the network and servers or operating systems. Routersploit is similar to Metasploit, but it is made specifically for embedded devices. And our last method for today is the exploitation of web UI/services. As mentioned in brute forcing, the web UI allows you to interact with the embedded device. Insecure interfaces such as web UIs can be subject to SQL injection, cross-site scripting attacks, command injection attacks, privilege escalation, and more. These attacks are used to perform session hijacking due to poor client-side filtering and input validation. The consequences of these attacks is that the user is able to retrieve sensitive information, they can escalate to root, do denial of service, and much more. In terms of tooling, as mentioned previously, Burp Suite is the industry standard for web app vulnerability exploitation. And a good way to learn how to use Burp Suite is Port Suite Labs, where they teach you common web attacks and you can actually have a go yourself. Cool, now we'll go through firmware hacking and the OWASP firmware testing methodology, which has 9 steps. So first step is information gathering and reconnaissance. So this involves collecting technical information on the target's firmware. Technical information such as the CPU, OS, and third-party components. And a method to do this is through OSINT. And our second step is obtaining the firmware. So you can obtain the firmware through the vendor's support site, directly from the manufacturer, or through hardware ports such as UART and JTAG. And then following on from obtaining the firmware, you can actually start analyzing the firmware. So the purpose of analyzing the firmware is to identify the characteristics. You can analyze the file types and the metadata of potential root file systems. Moving on to step 4, we can extract the file system contents from the firmware. Extracting the file system then allows us to identify potential security issues. And then we move on to analyzing. So now that we've extracted the file system, we can move on to analysis. And you can look at the config files and binaries to see if they have any vulnerabilities. And then further analysis, so dynamic analysis. So now the device is running normally or in the emulated environment, dynamic testing on firmware and applications interfaces can be performed. And some extra analysis as well, runtime analysis. In the same environment, you can analyze the compiled binaries. And last but not least, binary exploitation. So from the vulnerabilities found in the previous step, now it's time to exploit them to either attain root or do some remote code execution. And then now we're moving on to hardware hacking. So hardware hacking involves accessing/modifying the physical components of a device in a way that it wasn't intended to. The way in which you approach hacking the device depends on the outcome that you wish to achieve. Do you want to make this device wireless or alter what is displayed on the screen if there is one, or extract sensitive information from it? So I'll highlight 2 OWASP Top 10 IoT vulnerabilities that are relevant to hardware hacking. So the first one is the use of insecure or outdated components. Outdated/insecure hardware components can be targets for attackers. Third-party hardware can be compromised in the manufacturing process in the supply chain. And our second vulnerability is the lack of physical hardening. Physical components such as debug ports and memory cards can be used by attackers to gain sensitive information or control over the system. And we'll also be going through 3 methods of hardware hacking. So first, part/component replacement, analyzing inter-component communication, and looking at debug ports. So first method, as indicated by the name, is replacing components of the IoT device. The method in which you conduct this is through trial and error. Replacing parts of an IoT device can allow attackers to embed a chip that is malicious. Using smartphones as an example, some smartphones' source code conducts minimal checks between the physical component and the main processor of the device. And using that as a case study, an attacker can embed a chip that is malicious and steal sensitive information through the capture of keystrokes and install malicious apps, all without the knowledge of the owner. And second is analyzing intercomponent communication. One of the methods you can use, or one of the tools you can use, is a logic analyzer. And you can connect the logic analyzer to any point on the circuit board of the IoT device. And a logic analyzer is a tool that captures and displays multiple signals from a digital system or circuit. It is a useful tool for hardware hacking, as it can translate the signals it captures and output it into things such as timing diagrams and state machine traces. And through capturing intercomponent communications using a device like a logic analyzer, one can extract decryption keys. The outcome of that is that using the decrypted key, a malicious user can access sensitive information and gain access to an account. And lastly, one can perform hardware hacking through debug ports. This involves trying to physically access the debug ports that are supposedly inaccessible. This would involve disassembling the hardware so that one can gain access to the board or the chip. Two of these ports include the UART and JTAG port. The UART port stands for Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter. It acts as an intermediary between the serial and parallel interfaces. It converts parallel data from the controlling device to serial form and vice versa, hence making it bidirectional. A JTAG port, it stands for Joint Test Action Group. It is a debugging port that is used to perform boundary scanning. Boundary scanning allows for testing and debugging of the ports. This is done through limiting physical access to the selected few signals. An outcome of hacking debug ports is that attackers can replace the device's firmware with a rogue version and gain direct access to a shell. I'll now pass it on to Eddie to introduce our victim, the Nokia 5G router.
Hello. Okay, cool. Thanks, Tiara and Victoria. Before I get on to my bit, can we just have a quick round of applause for Tiara and Victoria? I know they were quite nervous getting into this, and I think they killed it. So, brief round of applause. Thank you. All right, so getting into it. Now, it wouldn't be a conference talk without disclosing some vulnerabilities, so I thought a good way to cement all of the learnings that we just went through, and there's quite a lot there, would be to actually try it on a device and see what happens. So for the purposes of this talk, I took a look at the Optus. It's a Nokia FastMile 5G router. It's actually shipped with all of the Optus 5G home internet plans. So if you were to go sign up for home Optus 5G, you'd probably get one of these devices. But before I get into the juicy stuff, just a note on responsible disclosure. So generally, people aren't too happy if you drop 0 days and then don't tell the vendor, and then people get hacked. So responsible disclosure, for those who aren't aware, typically, if you do find a vulnerability, they do recommend that you go through the vendor's process, make sure you tell them ahead of time before publicly disclosing, so they have some time to actually react and fix the thing. With that said, it can be a touchy subject, especially with regards to how long you wait for the vendor to go roll out a patch. In this case, I will be disclosing some vulnerabilities that are currently in the process of being patched, but what's important to keep in mind is the impact of the vulnerability. In this case, the vulnerabilities I'll be talking about, they're only exploitable locally if you have physical access to the device. And also, if you have the knowledge that's talked about in this talk, you're actually able to self-remediate as well, so it's not like you're just sitting there and you can't do anything about it. But overall though, the focus of the research was more about giving the community access to their own devices rather than pointing a finger at Nokia and Optus and being like, ha 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 ha, you guys did a bad thing, right? And also, there is a balance to be struck, especially with physical devices. Generally, and what I mean by that is generally with a device that's more secure, well, it's harder to root. And especially with devices that I physically own, I'd like to have access to my own device. So sometimes, do you really want the most secure device? I don't know. That's just me though. And finally, I did talk to Nokia security ahead of this talk. I did tell them that I was doing this talk and what I was going to be talking about, and they know about it. So it's not like they're going to find this on the internet and then send me a lawsuit. Well, hopefully not. I guess that could still happen. All right, so why the trash can? And it's cool. I called it the trash can because it kind of looks like one, right? Well, first off, this one's an easy one. Well, my new internet plan included it, so I moved to Optus 5G. It's actually kind of a cool device. I probably should have brought it today actually, but it's got like 5 antennas, it's directional, and it picks which antenna to use based off which direction the 5G tower is. It looks kind of funny. Well, that's not the fast mile, but that's a humidifier. But if you like slap one of these bad boys on it, it's like basically the same thing, right? And third reason, I didn't really have a third reason, but I thought the slides would look better with like 3 dot points there. So. All right, so starting with software. Now, I'd be lying if I said that, oh yeah, I knew to jump straight to software first. So really, it was like probably closer to starting with, Google. Yeah, sorry, I'm not a psychopath. So I had a Google for what work had already been done on Nokia routers, and it turns out there was actually quite a bit. There was nothing specific to the fast mile, but what I figured is that most companies, they want to reuse code, so probably some of the research that had been done on Nokia routers already would also apply to the fast mile. What I found was this guy's blog, and what he wrote about was basically that he found that if you could get access to this backup and restore utility to change the configuration, you could get root access to your own router. Unfortunately for us with the fast mile, I couldn't find this config backup restore function. And it turns out that it's the user admin account that's printed on the box of the router is actually not a full privilege user. So with that in mind, our first goal was to get access to the backup function. Luckily for us, Nokia did leave us 2 ways. I found 2 ways to get access to the function. And as a result, we got our first flag. Yeah, woo, local privesc, cool. So the first way was a classic access control vulnerability. And basically, the only authorization checks were done, they were only done in the front end. This has been assigned a CV number, and it's already been rolled out to these devices. So if you own one, sorry, I told them about it, they fixed it. So you can't use it anymore, unfortunately. For those who aren't aware of what an access control vulnerability is in the scope of like web application vulnerabilities, it basically means that the only control stopping you from accessing higher privilege functions is the fact that the button's missing. So it's kind of like that. And in terms of actually exploiting it, so when you log in, basically that's the response that you get back from the fastmail after you log in, and it tells the front end, are you an admin or not? And all you have to do is change that little 0 there to a 1, and boom, you've got access to the backup function. So the next way I found that you could access the backup function is a bit more egregious, and it turns out that every single device that got shipped by Optus has a secret super admin account, and they all have the same password. So this is being reserved with a CV number, but it's currently, Optus, amongst other things, they're quite busy at the moment. They're rolling out a patch for this at the moment. So if you have one of these devices and you want root access to it, I recommend calling someone and telling them to unplug it, because this super admin account's getting removed very soon. At least they picked a strong password, so props to them, I guess. So at this point, like, I'm feeling like this. I'm feeling pretty good. We just found 2 CVEs. We got some local privesc going on. I got my sunnies on, feeling good. But unfortunately, when I tried to follow the rest of the write-up to actually get root, it didn't work. So in the case of the fastmail, what happened is after I followed the rest of the write-up, we had SSH access, but we didn't have a full shell. We got dropped into a jail shell, and for those who aren't aware, a jail shell is basically an environment that the vendor designs where you're limited to a subset of commands. In this case, there was a shell command, but when I typed that shell command, it prompted me for a password that I didn't actually know. There was a rate limit on that as well, so I couldn't just like smash it with the brute force. So next I decided to, well, I gave up on that pretty quickly, and then I decided to change tact a bit. So let's look at hardware. I didn't know to look at hardware. I kind of looked at Google again. So I found another forum post, and turns out there's a hidden Type-C port, and it's like hidden very well and like very well protected by sticker. So if you take off the bottom of the device, it's right there. But like if you look at before, when I was poking around at it, it was just a blocked off port. Turns out when you plug into that Type-C port with a computer and you run ADB shell, which is Android debug, and you just get dropped into a root shell and you're done. I'm like, sweet, we got our second flag, we got root. And then if you look closely, there are also some gold pins there, and those are UART pins, as we talked about earlier, and that also drops you into the same root shell. But then I had to think. I'm like, wait, there's something not quite right, you know? Why is my router running Android? And like, none of the IP addressing I'd configured through the web UI is actually showing when I run ifconfig. Like that last address is the WAN address, and the first address is something I don't even know, and my LAN's supposed to be that. I don't see it. So then, after thinking about this for a while and looking at it for a long time, I came to the realization that the fastmile is actually two devices in one box. So what they'd done is Nokia basically was like, well, how do we give 5G routers to people? I know, let's take a 5G phone, tape it to a router, and ship it in a box and call it a router in one box. It turns out the Android side actually has the same chip that's in a Pixel 4. Obviously, it doesn't have a screen or speakers or anything, but yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. And then if you go back to the photo, you can see the phone side has a different PCB style as well to the router side. And then after the fact, I also realized that like there's UART pins on the other side of the wall as well, and by plugging into that, we get access to that same gel shell we got access to earlier. So really, our root flag is really a flag that's an Android root shell, not the other one. So we're 1 for 2. We still need to go. We need to get root on the second half. At this point, I'm like, wait, are these guys like messing with me? Did Nokia like do some hack the box here? Is this a challenge for me? Anyhow, so back to Google, and I found nothing. So unfortunately, at this point, I was all by myself. I had to look at firmware. So I followed the OWASP methodology with the firmware. I obtained it, then I unpacked it. I had a look at it. It's an 800 meg file, so I'm like, where do I even start? So at this point, I took some inspiration from a security researcher that I like really looked up to as a kid. I'm sure everyone in this room actually knows who this person is. It's Santa Claus, right? You're laughing, but you know, like he knows where you live, right? So he said make a list and check it twice. So that's exactly what I did. So I had to look at the firmware. I had to think about all the ways that I could potentially get root access on this side, and I just started making a list of these ideas and then checking off one of them one by one. So first, I could have, this is just one of the things on my list, I could have looked at CGI scripts in the web directory. So when you browse in the web UI of the fastmile, what happens is basically it calls these CGI scripts that are in a big directory to actually do the action. Maybe I could reverse engineer one of these scripts. Maybe there's a vulnerability in them that could get me access to the device. I could have reversed the actual binary for the jail shell. So when I found the binary that gets executed when I SSH'd, and it dropped me into that little guy. So I could have looked at that to maybe figure out like, well, what password is it actually prompting me for? Or maybe there's like a command injection thing there. There's the config management utility, so we have access to change the config. Maybe there's a vulnerability in that. I could try to figure out how to repack the firmware. Maybe if I just put a backdoor in the firmware, flash it onto the device, I could get access to it. I don't know. Finally, maybe I could have attacked the router from the Android side. So we have access to the Android side of the device. Maybe I could attack the router side from the Android side. Maybe there's some implicit trust going on there or something. Ultimately, though, the path to success and victory was via the third dot point, which is looking at the config management utility. So it turns out that the config management utility actually calls a script called add management user. And it has one interesting line in this little shell script. I'm going to flash it on the screen, and before I actually explain the issue, well, not really an issue, I guess it's more of a feature, I'll chuck it out to the crowd to see if anyone can tell me what's interesting about the script. Anyone? Hands up. Francis? All right. So I'll give you a hint. So basically, when this script is run, in this line, you can see basically what it's trying to do is it adds a user, creates it with a username that's fed into the script, adds a group, adds a user to a group, and at the very end there, it says it sets the shell for the user to that jail shell file. So then I was thinking, well, how do I make this script add my user without that last bit? Well, then I just have to read that if statement. And turns out there's a little username does not equal ONT user there. Well, that means I just need to make the username equal to ONT user, and it should drop into that second statement, right? So maybe if I created a user with ONT user as a username, it'll be created with a jail shell. Bingo! We are now root on both sides. That was fun, wasn't it? So to summarize, on the Android side of the device, the way you get root is you connect via USB-C and you type adb shell. And on the router side, you have to access the config backup utility and then change the username to ONT user, and you root on both sides. Cool. So now what can we do with this newfound access? Well, the Android side is basically just an Android phone. So like I thought, I don't know, I'll play some Flappy Bird. Obviously it doesn't have a screen, so I had to play it remotely over a tool called Screen Copy. I managed to get 4 points, so if anyone owns a Fastmail, I challenge you to beat me. It's very difficult with the micro stuttering and lag, so if you can beat me, do let me know. On the router side, the whole thing does have some cool LEDs on it, so I made them pink. And then after I did publish some blog posts about this, after I published a blog post about it, I had a guy from London reach out to me who owns a reverse logistics company. He owns 5,000 of these devices. And now I'm working with him to update the firmware for all of these devices, because it turns out if you take them out of Australia, they can't access Optus's update server. So they've all got old firmware. And luckily that admin username, the admin password is present on every single one of those, which means I can help him actually update all of these. But to summarize, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's that if you look around us, there's embedded devices all around us, right? That's probably running some firmware that's vulnerable. I don't know. Don't touch it. It's not ours. Right? If I want, like, you can listen to all the talks in the world, but the only way you're going to become a subject matter expert or anything is if you actually give it a go yourself. All right? There's lots of devices around, and there's not enough security people. So just go out there, just have a crack at it. And even if you're just replicating someone else's write-up, I think there's still things you can learn from that. Thank you.